The gentleman from North Carolina, the ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
So, Mr. Powell, I want to drill on what Mr. Stivers talked about. So, the idea that you instead of just having something that's zero emissions, that we have technology and innovation that could be commercialized, that we're on the cusp of it, in order to not just have zero emissions, but to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Walk through that.
Absolutely. This is a very important concept. This is what matters in the climate math. The use or disuse of fossil fuels doesn't matter in the climate math. Net zero emissions is what matters in the climate math. So we could continue to use fossil fuels just so long as we captured those emissions at that point and did something else with them, put them underground, use them to make a product. Or we could continue to use fossil fuels, allow some of those to go into the atmosphere as long as we were capturing an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide somewhere else. And in many cases, that might actually be the most economic thing to do.
So what can we do to make that happen?
Sure.
Because that seems like better than adaptation, that we need to just basically walk around in rain boots all the time and batten down the hatches for worse hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes. What is that?
So there are a couple of major classes of this. The first is, I think, ranking member Stivers mentioned, is plant more trees and use natural-based solutions to pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere. You can also do things with mechanical solutions. So there's a number of companies, one in Europe, two in the United States, one in Canada, that are using actual mechanical sort of large machines to pull it out of the atmosphere. Occidental Petroleum has just announced that they're going to build one of these machines at very large scale that will sequester eventually millions of tons of CO2 in the Permian Basin. So they're going to be pulling CO2. It's a carbon engineering machine, again, from Occidental Petroleum. They're going to be pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're going to be injecting it underground and actually using it to spur enhanced oil recovery so that the oil produced from those wells in the Permian may well be net negative barrels of oil, or even, so they'll be fully clean barrels of oil.
So that focus on R&D for us to have public sector working with the private sector to ensure we have next generation technology to directionally change the course of our emissions.
Absolutely. And so bills like the Use It Act, which again does an X Prize for this negative emissions technology, bills like the Leading Act, which is again a bipartisan bill that focuses on zero emission natural gas fired power plants, or bills like the VZ-McKinley Fossil Energy R&D Act, which does the same for coal technology, all would use the resources of the Department of Energy and the National Lab Complex, help really bring down the cost of these technologies.
Innovation.
If I may, sir.
So, Mr. Kotek, so I'll get to you, don't worry. Mr. Kotek, so nuclear. How many nuclear power plants do we have in the United States?
We've got 97 operating today, although
okay, so what does that mean in terms
96.
of production?
A little less than 20% of U.S. generation.
A little less. So in terms of carbon emissions, just for the record?
Yes, sir. More than half of the U.S. carbon-free generation comes from nuclear.
So 20% more than half. Mm-hmm. All right. So we take you offline. We implement the Green New Deal, take nuclear out of the mix. We've then, how do we replace your generation?
Well, what would happen today is you'd build a bunch of gas, by and large.
So we'd follow the Germans and stop nuclear power plants and then go to more CO2 emissions as a result of it.
That's, certainly the German experience has not led to the emission reductions promised.
Okay, so more emissions, more expensive power. Okay, just wanted to get that for the record. Mr. Burke, you talked about data. So let's talk data. Is the federal government doing a good job when it comes to giving you the data you need, making sure that we have open source data for you to use and analyze? Are we doing a good job, bad job? What kind of grade would you give us?
On economic data, doing a great job. A lot of data we can use. Data's pretty up to date.
I mean, risk data. For instance, where is the risk? We have a National Flood Insurance Program. Where are these properties? What do they look like? What's their elevation? Go through that basic set of data. We have Fannie and Freddie, largest holders of mortgages in the world. Where are those properties, right? So would additional data like that be useful for your ability to analyze the risk?
Absolutely.
Is that something as policymakers, regardless of our view on climate, or what to do about it, would that be useful data? Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. Mr. Karsner, in your experience, is that likewise something that we need to be pushing for, is greater data, greater transparency, of that data so that we can have better assessments of our risk.
Absolutely.
Taxpayer risk.
Absolutely indispensable, sir.
Okay. Thank you all, and thank you all for letting me cover quite a broad base here. But thanks for Mr. Powell for leaning in on innovation. I think that is the key for us to conquer this issue.